Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 93. My name's Dan Lizette, and thank you all for taking just a little bit of time out of your day to check out the show. This is a good one. My guest this week is Rob Walch from Libsyn and from Today in iOS, Podcast 411, and so many other things, which I talked to Rob about. But before we get into that, a few housekeeping things to take care of. A Patreon update, if you will. Thank you all very much who have jumped in from my call last week for some assistance with Patreon support. I do have one more at the $3 plus a month level of support that I would like to recognize. This person was so kind as to tell me that she had actually binge listened the show over the weekend, so that is super cool when that happens. This is from Couple Money Podcast. This is Elle Martinez from Couple Money Podcast. I'm actually not familiar with Elle's show, but I may be checking it out. It seems to be about married couples' financial lives and helping you with that. So there'll be a link in the show notes, as well as on the supporters page on the podcastdigest.info. You can find Elle and her show, Couple Money Podcast, right there. If you'd like to join in and help the Podcast Digest grow, take on some more things, increase some frequencies, so on and so forth, I would greatly appreciate it. There's also a link in the show notes to the Patreon page. With that said, folks, I hope everyone's had a great week, and let's get into my podcast conversation with the one and only Rob Walch from Libsyn. All right, we're back. And folks, as I mentioned up front, my guest this week for episode 93 is none other than Rob Walch from Libsyn. He is the VP of Podcaster Relations for Libsyn and host or co-host of all kinds of shows that we're going to be talking about all throughout this show. Rob, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Well, Dan, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining me. I know you are a high-demand podcast guest, so I really appreciate you taking the time. This must be, what is it, your 452nd guest spot by this point, Rob?
I've been on a few. Yeah, but that's turnabout's fair play. I started my podcast career interviewing other podcasters. So
now it's all coming.
I always make myself available wherever I can.
Before we get into that podcast career, though, I'd like to kind of spend the first few minutes of a conversation, Rob, letting listeners get to know about you personally before podcasting, long before you ever jumped onto this ship. Tell folks a little bit about kind of your pre-podcasting life and sort of what that road was like leading to it.
Pre-podcasting, I was a electrical engineer, and I designed quartz crystal oscillators. I went to the University of Dayton, so that's a big part of my persona, because if you're a Dayton Flyer, you're a Dayton Flyer fan for life. But no, I was a design engineer for many years. I ran engineering, and then I made the move to sales and marketing, and that was really where I was. I was VP of sales and marketing for a company called Bliley out of Erie, Pennsylvania, when when the podcasting bug hit me back in 2004 and podcasting was starting, and I was looking for a hobby, and I was traveling a lot. So podcasting became something that just took over and eventually, rather quickly, changed my career path. I moved out of the world of quartz crystal oscillators, which I had been in for 16 years, and into podcasting full time a few months later.
Wow, that was that's an interesting background to come from into podcasting. I've talked to a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds, never one with a quartz crystal oscillator background. That's unique.
You know, there actually is another podcaster who was from the quartz crystal industry, was my old boss. It was just ironic that he had a podcast called Aware Tech. He started out in the early days too, and unrelated to me doing this, he got into it, and he was a person who actually hired me out of college, and we've been talking back and forth for the years, but he did a podcast called Aware Tech early on. Wow.
I know when I spoke with Jacob Lewis from Neighbors, he was coming from kitchen cabinet making at one point, and I thought that was sort of one of the more unique background stories I heard, but That's a first. So let's talk about it. You said that you got into podcasting basically as a listener first when you were looking for companionship on travel, right?
That's what interested me. I mean, and then immediately realized I wanted to do it. So, I mean, you have to understand, back in 2004, podcasting was just starting. So this was early on. And I realized right away that as soon as I heard a couple, I want to do one of these. So it took me a couple months to figure out how to do it because back in 2004, late 2004, there were no tutorials. Right. I mean, the best tutorial was one from Engadget, and it said, if you want to podcast, add this enclosure tag to your RSS feed in your podcasting. And then I was like, what's an RSS feed? What's an enclosure tag? So I literally had to learn how to hand code an RSS feed and had to do all that and upload and host the files. And this was, before Libsyn even launched. So I'm looking at this in October 2004 and then into November and to get that launched. And then eventually Libsyn launched and I came on board with them as a host later on. But in the early days, there was no easy solution to it. But then again, in the early days, there was no easy way to even listen to a podcast. Right. There was no iTunes support. You had to download iPod or X and you had to really want something. And I happened to have an iPod from the early days and I wanted content on my iPod. And that's really what got me drawn to it. Was like, oh, I get those free content because I liked audiobooks. And now I can listen to people's podcasts like the Daily Source Code and Bib and Yaz and some of the other ones I listened to in the early days.
So how do you think you made that jump? I mean, that's, being a listener and then ultimately becoming a host and producer is kind of sort of the road most of us have traveled, I imagine. But for me, it took probably, 8 years of listening before I got to that point. What was it that you thought, how did you flip over to that so quickly? What was about it that really was that draw for you?
Oh, I always wanted to be kind of on the radio, and I used to be one of those annoying people that would call into the radio station so often they'd give you the backdoor number. So, but I had an uncle that told me, don't go into radio. There's no money in it. He owned a radio station. He says, so whatever you do, don't get into radio, So I went and became an engineer, but part of me always wanted to be kind of in the radio. So, I listened to my uncle, didn't go into radio, went into engineering, and then here I had a chance to do both. So I was like, oh, okay, I could have this as a hobby. And it just happened to be the hobby took over and left all the other stuff behind. But yeah, I don't think it was a big jump for me because it was something I always wanted to do.
Right. So what was that first show and what was that like putting it together?
The first show was Podcast 411, which was the first podcast about podcasting. It was the first podcast where I went out and I interviewed other podcasters. So the whole, it was kind of like your show. I went out and I interviewed podcasters, found out what they did, how they did it, what got them into it. So you can go to podcast411.com and you can find, if you want to listen to the history of podcasting, go back and listen to the old episodes of Podcast 411. You will learn more about how podcasting came to be because I talked to all the big and small names of podcasting back in the day. I mean, I've had some really great guests. In the first 5 guests I had CC Chapman was on in the early days on my podcast. And he was one of the first 5 I interviewed. Ann Bromley from Eat Feed. But everybody that's in the Podcast Hall of Fame, has been on Podcast 411 at one point. So I was lucky enough to get the right guests. I mean, including Leo Laporte and Adam Curry and then Ronald Moore from Battlestar Galactica when he was doing a podcast. Even Walt Mossberg came on the show. So I've had an interesting guest list on Podcast 411.
So compare and contrast that to today now, Rob. Now, as you mentioned, my show's very similar in that sense. Podcast 411 was sort of, the trailblazer that you did there with in terms of talking with other podcasters, interviews. Now, what I have found and what I've heard from a lot of my colleagues who do any type of interview or conversation-based show, booking is extraordinarily challenging. It's a much more complicated, convoluted process today than I imagine it was then. Back then, when it was sort of such a small group, was it just literally as sort of everybody was talking to everybody and it was much easier, or was it different?
Well, when I first decided, okay, here's what I'm going to do for the show, I'm going to interview other podcasters, I sent out an email to 7 people that were podcasting, and 5 of them replied and said, yeah, I'll come on the show. And it was, the show hadn't even launched yet. And one of the people that said, one replied no and one didn't even reply. The one that replied no was Chris Perillo, which I later chastised about that. I've gotten to meet Chris and know Chris, but he was the first one to ever say no. But I guess he was a bigger name at the time. And, downloads what's ego equals download squared. So, the other ones, they were real quick to say yes. And, CC Chapman, was one of the first in that first group. And he had this other podcast called, I think it was Reality Bitch Slap Radio or something like that. And it wasn't even his, marketing, or it wasn't even managing the gray. It was that podcast. So, it was fun. John Wall was one of the early ones. Mur Lafferty was one of the early guests. That's how I got to meet Mur and write a book with her. So it was fun in the early days. I guess it was easier because back then everybody was looking for promotion. And it got to the point where on Podcast 411, I really stopped reaching out at one point. Because I was just getting daily inundations like, hey, well, can I be on your show? Can I be on your show?
Right.
And that was, again, a sign of the times. I was just lucky enough to have that show launch when it launched. And then I had some big guests. I got Senator John Edwards come on the podcast. They're just running for coming off the vice presidential run. And so it was a nice group of guests.
So Podcast 411 led into the next show. Was that Today in iOS?
Then, the next one was Today in iOS. So, Apple came out in January of 2007 and Steve got up there on stage and he showed the iPhone and I said, oh, I have to have it. I said, but how can I justify the price? And I said, I know, I'll do a podcast on it. So I started Today in iPhone, which was what it was originally called. And I launched it in April, of 2007 before the iPhone launched. And the people at Audible, I knew some folks at Audible, and I said, hey, if I do this podcast, I'm going to launch it. And, here's how big Podcast 101 is. I think this show will be even bigger. And based on this, will you guys sponsor me? I think it was like $500 a month. I go, will you sponsor me $500 a month for the first 3 months? And they said yes. And I was like, cool. I've got my iPhone and my plan covered. and
you could bring it to your wife and have an explanation.
And I didn't even tell her about it for a while. So I launched it completely. I was like, she's going to kill me if she finds out I'm doing another podcast. So I started doing that podcast along with Podcast 401. And ultimately that podcast took over because it became so much bigger and where I generated revenue. And Podcast 411 kind of subsided and kind of call it on hiatus. And then I got the job with Libsyn and everything just, my time became very, taxed and I couldn't put the time into Podcast 401 that I needed to. So I used to do a lot of research. I would listen to multiple episodes and I'd write up all kinds of questions. I wasn't one, some of these marketing guys, they have this formulaic thing. I hate it. Where they send out the same exact 10 questions to every guest. They don't do any research and boom. And they do these, and then they don't vary, and then they don't go off script. They don't go off the questions they send out, the 10. They don't do follow up to something someone said. But no, that show I did a lot of research. Per episode.
Just as an aside, you're absolutely right. I've seen that before. I believe I've been on one show where that was the case, and I'm not going to name it, but I'm sure you see that all the time, and that's something that I strive really hard to make sure I don't fall into that. I remember when I spoke a couple months back, I talked with both of the Kitchen Sisters from Radiotopia. And I was so nervous speaking with them. They've had 30 years in audio storytelling, starting in public radio forever ago. And I'm thinking to myself, these two have been interviewed so many times, and there's no way I can tell the story of their careers in an hour-long conversation. And so what do I do differently? So I completely prepped in a totally different way and sort of attacked it with a nuance that I hope that they hadn't seen before. And at the end of it, I was happy with it, and I think they were too. So I think that's just something folks should definitely keep in mind, to not be one of those people you're describing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I never send out questions ahead of time. I would always, I would have some standard questions, but although other questions that were very customized to that show, and if I could geek out, sometimes I would interview someone from Sci-Fi podcast, and we would just geek out about Stargate or Star Wars, depending on, which sci-fi they were covering. Those are always fun. And then I think my most you mentioned being nervous. The most nerve-wracking one was definitely Ronald Moore, without a doubt. Because, for those that don't know, he was executive producer of Battlestar Galactica at the time. And he also did Deep Space Nine. So I was a big Ronald Moore fan. So it's always nice when you can get somebody you're fans with on your show. But yeah, I think I really believe that the best interviews are the ones where you just go off the rail and just have fun with it and go and have a knowledge of who the person is you're interviewing. And I've actually been on a couple of shows where they sent me like almost the identical list of same questions.
That's just tragic in my mind. You mentioned nerves, Rob. How do you do that? Being a long-time interviewer, when you find yourself in that nervous situation, is there any tips you can give anyone who to kind of bat down those butterflies?
The main thing was make sure you're recording in a method where you control the recording. So you didn't, that was always, the biggest fear is, it's not going to go right, and, a lot of times the bigger names people I interviewed, they're going to be on a cell phone. So I had to do Skype out to that. And the setup I have is rock solid. I record when I do my interviews, I record off the computer onto a digital recorder. So I think, early on in the days, I was always worried about the wrong things, which is this recording? And then once I got to where everything was offline, that helped a little bit. But, just being nervous, cause you're talking to someone, you're excited. You just don't want to sound like an idiot. I think, and that comes back to prep. But I think one of the funnier interviews I did was, with Quincy Jones, and I had to send the questions ahead of time.
Right.
And because as people said, you have to send the questions ahead of time. You have 20 minutes, no more. And we got into the first question, and he went off on a tangent, and we never went back to any of the questions. So we didn't even get to the rest of the questions I had prepared, and we went for 45 minutes. And he talked about all kinds of crazy stuff I had to edit out, talk about women and muffin tops and things like that.
I think I've heard you tell this story somewhere.
Yeah. So it was fun. Quincy was a good guest, cause it was, he didn't care what his handler said. He's a big name, and it's like, hey, my handlers are my handlers, but I'm me.
Right.
It's like, don't worry about what my people said.
So you talk about geeking out, and that's one of the reasons I first became aware of you, and that is I am also an Apple freak. Anybody who looks at my back catalog of interviews will see just most recently Jim Dalrymple. I've talked with Jason Snell and John Siracusa, Casey Liss, and so on and so forth. So that is a big deal for me. So let's talk about Today in iOS a little bit.
Well, I'm glad you didn't mention Andy Anako, because you can't say he's an Apple fan anymore, Matt. Throw him out the window, but
still technically appears on MacBreak, right?
Oh, yeah. Come on. He is such a turncoat.
Yeah, when I talked with Andy, I asked
him and the
him
mutton
about,
chops, out of here.
I did interview Andy, and I did talk to him about that. And
he sold out. He sold out. He completely, let me just say, he completely sold out, because look at when he turned was when all of a sudden he was pimping a new site, and he did it for total link bait. He did that article, Why I Switched, total link bait.
Do you listen to his Android-based show with, from Relay Material?
No.
I listen to Material because I'm a big Andy fan. I do like Andy a lot. And what was ironic is in a recent episode, he's talking about he attended his niece's wedding, and his niece asked him to help film the wedding ceremony and reception. And he, of course, as any technology journalist has, all these phones and devices and cameras and this, that, and the other. And he brought them all in, and he was, setting them up and this, that, and the other. And what was funny is, and he tells a story on Material that after testing and worrying about this, that, and the other, and he's his everyday carry nowadays is the Nexus 5X, I believe. But when he shot the wedding, he took 2 iPhone 6S Pluses, and he filmed the whole wedding on 2 iPhones, because he says the quality was great, the reliability was there, and there was no way he was going to trust an Android device to film this wedding. And so that's how he filmed it, on 2 iPhones. And he goes through the whole reasoning behind it. And I think he's still got some affection for Apple.
Well, again, if you listen to Today in iOS, I called him out on it. So I'm not saying anything here I didn't say on Today in iOS, but I said, his article was complete link bait, and he just sold out because he was moving to a new site, and he was a new partner, and they needed to get publicity to the new service that they were moving to and launching. And it was just complete sellout. So I lost all respect. I'm sorry.
Well, during iOS, you've highlighted all kinds of issues on Today in iOS, whether that be Samsung or security or device releases or on and on and on. Talk about sort of how this began, because this thing has grown. You mentioned that. I mean, it just from being a listener all these years, you can see the that you've added so much complexity to the show now. There's so many more questions and segments, and you can tell, on depending on the topic, how much research you do. How has this monstrosity kind of taken off over the years?
It started out, it was funny, there was no Android. So when Today and iPhone launched, the competition was quote Windows Phone and BlackBerry. And it wasn't even Windows Phone. What did they call it back then? It was before Windows Phone.
Mobile, right? Windows Mobile.
Yeah, Windows Mobile. Thank you. Yeah. The Android part came up, just over time. The people were first off, they were overestimating how much Androids there were. And I would say, hey, let's get the numbers right. Apple was still at that point, at one point, much bigger market share. And then there's always about the monetization part. But what's funny is, it's a fanboy podcast, Today on iOS. I make no bones about it. In the beginning, there's a little clip that says, hey, Kool-Aid. And then I have a segment in the show which will basically go over issues with Android. I'll talk about security issues or malware. It's so easy to talk about. I could do a malware article every episode if I wanted to. Yeah. And people's issues with Android. And I do this just to point out, hey, it's reporting, and people are like, oh, you're bashing Android, you're bashing this and that. And I'm like, it's a fanboy podcast. It's funny. I'll read the negative 1-star reviews in iTunes are always from, and he bashes the other platforms. Yes, I do. That's part of the show. Deal with it. It's so funny, the way people get upset. And then I've had people in one episode, one episode I must have done really well, because in one episode I got someone email me saying I was a blind, loyal fanboy, and then another person saying I was bashing Apple from the same episode. So I'm like, okay, well, I must have done that one right. So I got both extremes were mad at me on that episode, which is fine. I don't mind people being upset. If I don't ruffle a few feathers and don't, ire a few people, then it's boring. So I don't worry about that. If you never got hate mail as a podcaster, you're not doing something right.
What's your production process like, Rob? Because it feels like a lot. I mean, I'm sure you've got it down to a routine now, but with pulling in all these questions and these emails, and you've got contest giveaways and songs, sent in, and artwork to add, it just seems like there's so many moving pieces. What's a regular week look like for you?
Lots of Evernote, so I manage everything in Evernote. So every episode gets each episode gets its own tag in Evernote, and I have a lot of different items for that are tagged, and including the intro and that, and I manage stuff in email folders and folders on my desktop where people send me in artwork. So for those that aren't familiar with the show, every episode I have custom artwork for that episode that was sent in from a listener. I have custom music that was sent in from a listener. So I got to manage that. And then I got a lot of listener feedback. So I got voicemail messages where people call into the show. 206 Moondog is the phone number. Or they can email me todayandios@gmail.com. And I manage a lot of that. That'll come in, and I put things into folders, and then the production process, when I get ready to go, I'll pound down a 5-hour energy drink. It's usually around 10 or 11 at night. And I start producing, and I do it all on GarageBand. And I do multiple tracks, and I use GarageBand because I can use Sound Soap to clean up the background noise. Like right now, you hear this lawnmower because the neighbor kicked in. You would run Sound Soap and pull that out. But yeah, I do that because a lot of people will call in from their car, and sometimes it sounds like they're calling in from a convertible, and I have to pull out the background noise on that. So the production part of it really is GarageBand. I do everything in GarageBand. I record from my Yeti mic that's plugged in via USB to my MacBook, and I do it all that way. But the prep work is a lot of Evernote, and I script out everything. The whole episode is scripted. When I first started the show, I did it bullet points because I didn't believe in scripting, because I was doing Today and in a podcast 411. I never scripted for that. It was interviews. I didn't believe in scripting. And then I was doing bullet points, and I finally called Ken Ray from macOS Ken, and I'm like, Ken, how do you do it? Because I love his show, and I'm like, how do you do it every episode, man? You don't make any technical mistakes, because I'm finding out I was saying the wrong thing. I knew the right thing, but I'd say the wrong thing. And he's like, he goes, I script it. I go, what? He goes, yeah. He goes, you have to. You gotta script it. He goes, you're going to say the wrong processor name. You're going to say the wrong software if you don't. So I went to scripting ever since that early advice from Ken, and Evernote became the way to do that. So that's my process.
You're obviously an Evernote premium member.
You know what? I'm not.
Really? You've been able to do all this on the free plan. I'm
on the free plan. I am, do it all. But the thing is, just don't upload pictures and stuff like that. Just keep it all text.
Okay, so the art and the music doesn't get fit in there.
No, none of that stuff goes into Evernote. So no, Evernote's just all for the textual part of it, and I just go through script and I edit as I read, because not only do I script, but I'm dyslexic, so I'm constantly making mistakes, and I'm having to stop, boom, go back, fix, stop, go back, fix. I might do 300 edits in a single episode.
Wow.
Which sounds insane, but I've counted it, and it's unbelievable the amount of edits I have.
I think Today in iOS is probably a case study in community growth, because now it seems like it is just vibrant. I know you had the Google Plus group there, and even before then you could tell just from the interaction with the listeners. Why do you think you have been able to establish this where maybe others have had more difficulty? Obviously, a lot of episodes, a lot of time, a lot of work, but is there something in particular that you feel you could point to that was really helpful in kind of cultivating this whole thing?
I started from day one cultivating it. I mean, I started from day one saying, hey, come and be part of the show. And then I answer emails. Every email, people that send in, I try to answer them. If I don't read them on the air, I answer them. So you have to answer the emails. You have to interact with the audience. You have to make it easy. You have to mention you have a phone number. You have to have a phone number. You have to make it easy for them to call in. You have to have an email address. You got to make it easy for them to email into you. You got to have links in that. And then I launched the app for the show, Today in iOS app. And when I did that, boy, the amount of feedback I get to the show was even more, because it was easy for them to tap a button on their iPhone app and call. And then I have the advantage that my audience is iOS people, so they have iPhones, so they're listening on an iPhone where they can hit a button and click call. And it's always been funny. I go through where I have too much voicemail message, and then I have not enough. And it wanes, goes back and forth through the year.
Right.
So right now, this month and last month, traditionally, I don't get enough voicemail messages. And then come June and September and October, I get too many.
Right.
And I can't get through them all. Because, people get, they want to talk more about what was just launched. So WWDC coming up in June will cause a lot more feedback. People will call in right before and right after with their thoughts on what they think is going to happen and what didn't happen. So we'll get that. But I think the answer to your question is I just encourage the feedback and told people, this is their show. Come on. And I'll let some crazy ones on. Probably more than I should sometimes. I had one guy who would leave me literally 20-minute long voicemail messages.
I think I know who you're talking about. There was one guy who you had really long messages on, almost week in and week out for a while there.
Yeah, his weren't that long. That was Daniel from the UK.
I was going to say, I knew there was an accent. I couldn't remember his name.
Yeah,
yes.
Daniel from Wish Beach.
Yes.
In the UK. Wisby in the UK. And some people loved him, some people didn't. Then he switched to Android, and I said, well, now you're not going to get your voicemails on. And then he switched back from Android. Once he got over there, he realized how much just horrible it was. So, but there are some longtime callers that have, called into the show that I know, just as soon as I hear the voicemail message, I know who it is. And I'll make sure they get on. But the one guy, there was one, he just peppered me with really long ones. So at the end of one episode, I put like 3 of them on there. It was like 40 minutes of him just back to back to back ranting. And I got emails like, don't ever do that again. I'm like, well, I put it at the end. I put it at the end. So, but the guy, I guess, he must have found it offensive for me to do the way I did it, because he never called in again.
Oh, well.
So that was funny. I guess because I didn't comment. I just put it at the end. I didn't comment on it.
Oh, he wanted you to interact with what he was saying.
Yeah, he wanted me to answer or something.
Gotcha.
That didn't happen.
So let's take a quick little tangent here, Rob, because it wouldn't be prudent of me to have a chance to talk to you and not ask you a couple quick questions on Apple itself. As I've done, I did this with everyone else that I've talked to, from Jason and Andy and John and all those folks. So you mentioned it, WWDC's coming up. I imagine you're going to end up doing your bingo card again.
Yes. Yeah.
Personally, not necessarily a prediction. Personally, what do you want to see in the next 3 to 6 months? What's the one thing on any device or Apple related that you really want to have at this point?
Locked folders, password locked folders, or even password locking apps on your iOS device. I think that's the one thing that I wish Apple had. Because there's times where you don't want to lock the whole phone down. You want to give it to your kids to play with your phone.
Right.
But I don't want my kid opening up Slack and then sending a message off to my boss. Yeah. Or go and Evernote and renew my show notes. I would like for there to be certain things, especially Slack for me. It would be great to have that locked down so that only, I can open it and not just locked down, but it password protected, but, with Touch ID.
Right.
So when I go to tap on it, to put my thumb on it, boom, it's unlocked. So that's what I would like to see.
Do you
folders
think they'll do it? Because they did something similar in Notes, right? But I don't even like how they did that because they didn't do it at sort of the folder level. They've done it at the individual note level, so it's somewhat of a pain to me. But they did use Touch ID and locking down functionality in Notes. Do you think it's going to happen on an app-based level?
I would love to see it on an app or a folder basis. This folder, would be fine too because you just put the app behind the folder.
Right.
But I would love it at the app level. If not the app, then the folder level. I really hope they do that. There's jailbreaks out there that allow you to do that. I mean, so it's been in the jailbreak community for a while. So, of all the features, I think that's the one that I want to see more than anything else.
In your opinion, is jailbreaking waning in popularity or is it bigger than ever?
Waning.
I think so too. Yeah, it seems like.
Yeah, no, it's definitely waning. There's reasons. A lot of the reasons are a lot of the good reasons to jailbreak are gone.
Right.
I mean, there was, I think one of the biggest reasons people jailbreaked for the longest time was tethering.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that one's gone, and for most people, most plans, that's gone. So I think that that killed it there, and there were other things too. But over the years, a lot of the reasons people jailbreak, Apple looked at, okay, this is popular, now we'll use this, and don't for a second think they weren't looking at what was going on in the jailbreaking world.
Yeah,
because they absolutely were, and so it was a good test bed to prove out future technologies, and it still is. I mean, and I still try to keep a device jailbroken here or there. I think I have one or two right now that are still jailbroken out of all of them. I obviously have a lot of iOS devices. But the number of questions and the amount I talk about it on the show has definitely declined because the amount of interest from listeners has declined. So now I don't know if it's chicken or egg, but I would believe it. It's more just people not as willing to do it anymore.
Yeah. I've done it. I did it, I think, twice. And the second time was, I don't know what I did right or wrong, but I had such a horrible in and out of the process. I swore to myself I was never going to do it again. And that was maybe 4 years ago. And I think I probably did something wrong. And this was back when they had, and I don't even know if it seems so, this words keep coming in my tiny umbrella. Yeah, all that. There's something messed up in that process. And it was just... Ugh.
The thing with jailbreaking is, I always say to people, look, most people bought an iPhone because they don't want anything to go wrong. So understand, if you jailbreak, things are going to go wrong. Yeah. If you get upset with how people fold the towels in your house or how you hang that toilet paper on the toilet paper roll, you are not the right person for jailbreaking.
Right.
That you are not the right personality. So you have to be willing to accept the fact that things are going to go crazy, and the more apps you add and the more stuff you add to the jailbreak, the wonkier it becomes. Yeah. So
Well, the one reason I think that's still out there for jailbreaking or would mean the most to me, and the one thing I hope that's coming down the pike is default apps. To be able to switch out default apps would be marvelous. And I think that's one thing really holding back iOS at this point.
And that is a rumor that, that's clearly going to be on the bingo card as one of the key rumors is being able to pick default apps. Yeah. So you can have a default browser and default mail client. Those are the two that people obviously want the most.
Those for sure. Twitter
and the calendar.
Twitter clients too. Yeah. I think would be nice. For some reason I have to keep the regular Twitter app on there, but I don't want it. But sometimes the regular Twitter app works great for search. Other than that, Tweetbot all the way. But okay, all right. A couple other topics I wanted to touch on with you, Rob. You are probably the most influential person to me when I started the show in September 2014, because in late August, when I decided what I wanted to do and put this together, I used your Podcast 101 ebook and literally followed it page by page by page. You were talking about when you started that there were very few references, source material to be able to know how to do this, but you had since put this together. Can you talk about why you did that and what you were hoping to accomplish with that?
It's very simple. There are a lot of people out there that are putting together these tutorials that they charge $1,200, $1,500, $900, $800 to teach you how to podcast. And most of those tutorials I've looked at and got a chance to look at are crap. And the people are just giving bad advice. I always say it goes this way in podcasting. The value of the advice you get in podcasting is inversely proportional to the price. The more you spend, the worse the advice. The less you spend, the better the advice. The free tutorials tend to be the best ones out there. And I put together the tutorial just to help people. And it was before that was even an ebook. It was a free tutorial on Podcast 411, and it was different web pages. And I actually put that together using iBook Author. Yep. And I did it in one weekend during football playoffs. I sat there and watched football playoffs on a Saturday and Sunday and with the laptop on my lap, and I just created it the whole weekend. And the longest part of creating that tutorial was finding the Creative Commons free artwork for each chapter. Right. So if you actually if you go and download the iBook, it's called Podcast 101. It's in iTunes. It's free. But the chapter artwork, at the beginning of each chapter, that took more than the rest of the iBook to put together. Because I'd already had it. I was just copying and pasting the other stuff together in the first version. And this is the second version. I got a third version I'm in the midst of working on right now. So hopefully by July, I will have the 2016 version out, which will be updated on all processes. Plus, I'm going to add in GarageBand. So I'm working on the GarageBand part of it because I have it based on Audacity in there, and now I'm going to have both Audacity and GarageBand in it.
And I was going to ask if you were going to continue to keep it updated, because I, for one, pretty much down to the letter still do exactly what you prescribed. And I'm like I said, now 93 episodes in, literally my post-production process is pretty much step by step. And I remember I had this the ebook open in iBooks on my Mac during like my first 6 episodes. I would literally go page by page to make sure I was doing it right. So I thank you for that, and I'm sure there are hundreds, if not more, people who have done the same as me. So I think it's a great resource, folks, and I want to make sure that link is in the show notes as well.
Yeah. Even if I hadn't wanted to update it, Apple forced my hand to update it with iTunes 12.4, because 12.4 you no longer right-click on the AIF file or WAV file to convert it to MP3. Now you have to click on it and go up to File and then go to Create New Version and then Create MP3.
Oh, geez, I'm glad I haven't updated yet.
Oh, yeah. So when you go to update iTunes, you're going to be like, normally you pull it in, you go to your music file where you've dragged the file into, and then you right click on it. And there was an option to convert to MP3. And everybody that does that all of a sudden goes, where'd it go? They got rid of that. It's not there. So you have to actually go up to File. After you click on it, you go up to File, and then you go down and there's a convert to version. And then you go to another menu that says convert to MP3. So it's hidden. So that was like causing a lot of panic on people, in the last couple weeks. And luckily I happened to read, about it before I went to do my episode. The night I was getting ready to do my episode, I read about someone else saying they couldn't find it. And then someone else said, oh, here it is. And I was like, oh, because I would have been like 3 a.m. going, how do I convert this thing to MP3?
Yeah, and and that's the thing, right? And I've got this paralyzing fear with updates to what I call my podcasting machine. It's all on a Mac Mini, and I'm not on El Capitan yet. I was worried about Levelator. Although I've heard, I understand that they did an update for it, makes it work, and that's fine. But I've got a MacBook Pro that I'm testing that with, and so I'm just like pulling down Dropbox files to test it there to make sure before I do the update. But now this iTunes thing's had me freaked out again.
Right, and I'm actually the same way. I haven't converted my MacBook, which I do my main production on, to El Capitan yet. I just converted my son's MacBook over to El Capitan, and my wife's, I have hers at El Capitan. So I'm doing a little testing, but yeah, I need to do mine. And so mine's going to be the last one. And here's why I love Apple. So here's an Apple story for you. My old MacBook, I updated last year. I moved up to the MacBook 2015, and I had the MacBook 2011. And I wanted to pass it to my son who's 10, and so he can start learning Xcode and programming. And I went and wiped the machine clean last year, right before Christmas. I was going to give it to him for Christmas, and I figured I must have screwed something up because screens went wiggly lines. I was like, oh no, what I do? So I've been spending time back and forth trying to figure out, okay, wiping it hard, clean, getting a new hard drive, thinking it was something I did. Finally find this thing. I said, I'm just going to look up squiggly lines, MacBook 2011. And this finds out, it says, you have a processor, bad processor, and Apple covers it under a warranty. So I brought it in this past week. So this is Monday, it was last Wednesday. I brought it in to Apple and said, hey, here it is. It says it's covered under warranty. And they said, yep, we'll get it back to you. Saturday they call, I go and bring it back. Not only did they replace the graphics card for no cost, they put in a brand new battery. They put in a new DVD drive. They added a new back sleeve on the black bar on the back because they said cosmetically it didn't look good. And then they added a new power adapter board.
Wow.
All free.
Talk about adding life to a machine.
Yes. So here's my son now. He's got a brand new machine from 2011 with a brand new graphics card and main logic board, new battery, everything. So it was like, and not a penny. And, that was from 2011. That's why I love Apple.
That's awesome. That is it. I'm with you on that one. Fortunately, I've had very few times where I've had to utilize the Genius Bar, but I have had, my current, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, the very first one I got it during launch week, and it had a problem right out of the gate. I don't know, first batch or whatever the problem was. I had bought it from Verizon, but brought it back to Apple because it was a hardware issue, and they immediately swapped it. They gave me a brand new one. And I was like, great. And I've had no problem since. And that's just, and it was, no questions, no issues, no, how did this happen? It was wonderful. So.
Yeah, Apple is wonderful. So, I haven't even told that story yet on my show. So you got it before I got it out on my podcast.
Hey.
It'll be on this week. So, but I'm going to go through the list of things that they replaced. And again, it's just, when I got it back and they go, oh yeah, we did this for you, this and this and this. No cost. Here you go. And I'm like, wow. And I just fired up his machine and it worked great. And then I got everything reformatted and I put El Capitan on it and Xcode and downloaded stuff. And for him, he was so excited because I put, he really wanted Minecraft. So I put Minecraft on it and now he's happy. And this summer he earns chips. So he gets 15 minutes of time that he spends learning how to code. He gets a chip and that's worth 15 minutes of time doing whatever he wants on the laptop.
There we go. Hey, that sounds like a good deal. That sounds like a good deal. I mentioned this just up front briefly, but I do want to dig in a little bit. Your role at Libsyn, VP of Podcaster Relations, I want to I don't think I've heard you talk about before, and you probably have somewhere. Take us through sort of what is your average day, week, kind of what are you doing all day and week with regards to Libsyn? Kind of give folks an idea of that.
A lot of email and phone calls. There's a lot of emails answering questions. I take care of any inbound requests for people that want to become clients. I'll answer all of those. I do a lot of biz dev. So when we had the launch, when Google Play Music launched, we already had a relationship set up with Google Play, so that we had a Google Play Music destination. So, if you're a podcaster, you don't want to submit your same RSS feed that you submit to Google Play that you submit to iTunes. You want to submit the one from a separate one. So we have a separate one that you submit to Google. This way, you can have your own categories for Google and your own artwork and your own description for Google and a separate feed with all the stuff for iTunes. Because Apple and Google aren't going to always agree on what are the right categories. So, part of my day is doing that. Same thing when we had the Spotify launch. When Spotify launched, Libsyn was the only one that was a partner with them. So I work on getting those types of partnerships up. And then I work with a lot of our Libsyn Pro customers. And then the other part of my day is helping bring advertising. So I deal with advertisers and ads and help bring ad campaigns to different podcasters. And then talking community outreach like this, talking with you. This is... I'm getting paid for this.
Isn't that great?
Yes, I'm living the life.
So on that destination thing, you brought it up. I'm not going to pin you to the wall or anything, but I'll just bring up two things on the destination conversation that maybe you could hint if there's anything off in the future. Patreon or Medium as destinations. Any thought or ideas of those type of things?
Probably not so much on Patreon because we already have a solution for you if you want to generate revenue and make premium content, and it's really well integrated and it's better than Patreon in the respect that you can make it easier to get people content and you get a smartphone app and, so we have that. So probably nothing on the Patreon side. On the Medium side, I don't know. We'll have to look at that a little bit more. We're always looking at adding destinations. It depends on if they have the APIs available to publish into. We would love to do Pinterest, but Pinterest just doesn't have the publishing. It doesn't allow you to publish into it. And there's others we've wanted to do that just don't have the tools to allow us to publish into them. So we support publishing into Blogger and Tumblr, and WordPress already directly from our tools, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Right. And SoundCloud and Google Play and Spotify and TuneIn. So we have a lot of destinations and we have others coming. But Medium isn't one of the ones on my radar. I haven't heard that they had an API. I'd have to look into it to see if they have an API to allow that.
I would have no idea. I just know that that's becoming an ever-growing popular location where a lot of people are going, and you're hearing a lot more about kind of some of the social sharing that's happening inside of there and the following of particular authors and da-da-da-da-da. I even gave it a shot manually to try to pull it off, and I think I could have done it, but it would have been extraordinarily difficult, so I backed away with the hopes that maybe you guys one day will add that. But we will continue to patiently see how that happens.
Well, it's one I will look into. Yeah. Again, if they allow it, our system's set up to easily add new destinations. So we designed it for adding destinations, and we want to add as many as people would like, where it makes sense. So
cool. You also mentioned something earlier on, and you didn't detail it just now, but I know that a big part of your responsibilities at Libsyn are a lot of the travel, a lot of the attending of the conferences and things of that nature. I'm going to my first one in July with Podcast Movement. That'll be my first time. But I know you do this often. Can you tell folks who are maybe sort of on the fence about attending any conference, even, a local regional one, sort of, what do you see as the benefits? What are some of the best things to come out of those in your opinion?
You have to go to them. I mean, you need to, if you really want to grow and network in the community, the online world, there's no better networking than in the offline world, which makes no sense, but shaking somebody's hand and meeting somebody and getting a relationship with them and hanging out and having a burger or a beer or a drink or whatever it is that you do, what you consume. And all the vegans and all the non-drinkers are mad at me, but, but the point is there is nothing like sitting down and just shaking hands and meeting someone. And it's harder for people to be a troll to you face to face. I mean, very few people will say to you things online that they're going to say, some of these trolls, so people tend to be much, much more civil, face to face. And it gives you a chance to really meet someone and know what they're like. I've been to pretty much every major podcasting event, national event there's ever been. I was at all the podcast expos, all the blog worlds, all the new media expos, all the podcast movements. So I've been to all of those major ones. I've been to many different pod camps. So I haven't been to all the pod camps. There's so many, but I've been to a lot of the pod camps. I've been to I've spoken at well over 100 events in 10 years, 11 plus years, about podcasting. And it's just, I really strongly believe in doing that. If you can't afford to go regionally, there's going to be something local. There's word camps and there's, podcast meetups. Take a look in your local town and see if there's a meetup. If there isn't one, start one. I've been running the podcast meetup for Kansas City for over 11 years. We've been having monthly meetups. So it's good to meet the people locally.
At a local meetup, how would that differ than, say, a conference? At a local meetup, I'm imagining there's not necessarily sessions per se. They're obviously shorter in duration. But if I wanted to start one of those locally, sort of what is the content? What is sort of an agenda for a local meetup?
We have two formats we do for our meetups. Sometimes they're more casual. We meet at a place called Johnny's, which is Johnny's Bar and Grill, and it's more social. And we'll spend probably as much time talking about sci-fi as we will podcasting. Just happens to be a bunch of us that at the core ones that go, we're big sci-fi fans. But there's also some sports fans. We'll talk sports. And then we'll do more formal ones. So like this past month, we had, a more formal presentation. And actually the last three were more formal presentations where we got up and we talked more, about a specific topic. And so like the last one, I called it the birds and bees of podcasting, or where did downloads come from? And we went over all of, how iTunes works and how Google Play works and how to optimize for those and I broke down literally where are the podcast downloads coming from. And you can see that your RSS feed is the most important thing. Website, very small part. And we went over that. So that was more of a formal one. And in the month before I did that one. The month before that, I had another person by the name of Brett Burry who did the presentation. And you have to find a good place to do those presentations. So that's hard. Whereas the bar one is easier when we just meet and it's usually smaller and it's like 10 people or so. Whereas the one when we do the more presentation, we'll get up 18, 20, 25, 30 people will show up when we do a presentation. So
it could be kind of tutorials or current events, if you will, discussions. Does it sometimes turn into a Q&A, especially for you? Yes. I imagine, given your role, people are probably peppering you with a lot of help-based things.
Well, yeah, any good presentation should be Q&A. I mean, I believe firmly that any presentation should have questions and answers on it and available at the end. You should always block off the time. No, the podcast movement's real tough to do that, though, because they only give you a short period of time, like 45 minutes for the presentation. So you really have to cut it down to fit Q&A in. But, I would say if you're going to start a meetup, start it socially, meet at a local bar and grill, get a few core people involved, and then figure out what you want to do for presentations, and then start looking around town for a place like one of these shared workspaces. We're currently doing our presentations at a place called The Grid. And it's a shared workspace that has a room that's available for presentations, and it gives them some publicity. It brings people into the building to show, hey, here's a place you can go work other than working from your house. So look for those shared workspaces and see if you can get them to volunteer to allow you to come in and present. If not, you can always do it at a library. When people do it at libraries, you can rent a room, get some money put together. But first things first, make it social, meet some of the local podcasters. People just want to talk, see that there's others supporting and going through the same thing and as you're going through as a podcaster. But given, where you are in Philly, there are podcast meetups there, and there are events that go on. And there's going to be a podcast, Mid-Atlantic or there's one coming up here in September in your area.
Yeah, I know DC is at some point too, which isn't far.
Right. And I'll be in DC in July at Blogging While Brown conference.
You're always traveling, Rob.
So that'll be, and then I've got one in August and I'm speaking at WordCamp. KC, next month. So I'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, there'll be 4 times I'll speak in the next, July and August and June.
I imagine nowadays, Rob, you don't need Audible to fund your device purchases. You can probably just use your frequent flyer miles at this point.
No, I do get advertising on Today on iOS, and that advertising pays for my gadget addiction.
Well, I think you should talk with American or Delta. They should be sponsors too.
Yeah,
Southwest.
Well, I'm Southwest.
There you go.
Because I'm Kansas City. If you're in Kansas City, the only choice is Southwest.
Yeah, you have to support the home team.
Yeah.
One last topic I wanted to cover, Rob. There seems to be so much chatter as we sit here, late May 2016, about any number of topics surrounding podcasting, whether it be the idea of, Apple getting more involved with the statistics and or advertising in general, or, crowdfunding, or so on and so forth. In your opinion, with your vast experience in the industry, what do you think, looking out over, say, the next 12 to 24 months, is going to be the biggest challenge that's podcasting's facing, and how do you see sort of the industry getting up and over that hump?
Well, I always hear this challenge. What's podcasting challenge? There isn't. I don't see this challenge, because I think what it is there's this misconception by, especially the folks that come out of the New York podcast bubble, the public radio, not the New York indie podcasters, but the professional podcasters and the WNYCs and the NPRs and those folks and the Gimlets. And there's this misconception that there's going to be a hockey stick in podcasting for consumption. It's just not going to happen. And I think people think, well, if Apple does this, that will cause a hockey stick. Or if Apple does that, that'll cause a hockey stick. The hockey stick happened already. That was back in 2005 when Apple launched iTunes. And then it's been a straight line. It's been pretty steady growth for podcasting ever since. We have the numbers. We can see it. And I hate that this is misconception that there's this boom in podcasting or resurgence in podcasting, because there isn't. It's been steady growth. There's been a resurgence in media coverage of podcasting for sure. But as far as consumption goes, it's been steady growth, and which is good. But there's never going to be, and people need to get over this, there's never going to be another hockey stick in podcast consumption. It's long form content. You have to be in it for the long play. And no matter what Apple does or doesn't do, or anyone else does or doesn't do, there will never be this hockey stick growth in podcasting. The RSS feed is the most important thing. Here's how you can tell if someone's an idiot when it comes to podcasting. If they say two things, they say get rid of the RSS feed, or they say change the name. Right. If they say either of those things, just stop reading the article, because you're wasting your time, and you'll never get that part of your life back, and you're just going to read crap. The RSS feed still controls over 80% of your downloads. The RSS feed is so important to podcasting, even if the end users don't even know it exists. And the name podcast is what it is. It will always be podcasting. And if you don't believe it, I wrote an article 9 years ago that said it, and is so true still today. So that's how you can tell if someone's full of crap when it comes to podcasting, if they go after either of those points.
But let me ask you this. Do you think there is an exposure issue? And what I mean by that is, I still have this experience almost 2 years in, and I imagine there are probably times, especially if you meet new people at, say, a Chiefs game or something, what's a podcast? And that
most people know. If most people know, I mean, nowadays it is actually over 50% of people know what a podcast is when they are asked. And not only that, I don't even ask people if they know what a podcast is. I go now say to them, "What podcast do you listen to?" And more times than not, they will say, "Oh, I listen to this or that."
And I've had that experience, but I've also had the other side of that 50%, which is still, this lack of familiarity, not just in how to access them, but in what they are in the first place. And I think that, to me, is sort of what I was referring to when I talk about a challenge. Like, how does that gap get bridged? And one of the things I think is that, when you hear about Serial, or now, previous guest Aaron Mahnke with Lore, and what's happening there, these TV adaptations, do you think this continued sort of, spreading out into other mediums, these TV adaptations, I think, could go a long way, because when people say, wow, that started as a podcast, maybe I should open that app on my phone. Do you think that would help?
Well, yeah. Anytime you have a Serial or any other popular podcast, Hardcore History, Dan Carlin, any of these that are popular help bring in people. Anytime you have a celebrity, people are like, oh, I hate when celebrities come into this, as an indie podcaster. I don't, because when a celebrity comes in, he brings in his fan base. And every celebrity that comes into podcasting, so now you've got Sean Hannity's podcasting, for the first time, free podcast. He's bringing in part of his 12.5 million radio listeners. That's great for podcasting.
Yeah, I completely
But to answer your question, again, it's a long play. It's a long form content. It's a long play. It's word of mouth marketing. That's what spreads. That's how podcasting spreads. That's how serial spread. It was word of mouth. I mean, it started off well because of This American Life, but it grew bigger because of word of mouth and people saying, hey, you need to listen to this. You need to listen to this. That's how podcasting grows. There's nothing magical Apple can do. Apple's already done what they could do. Right. I mean, it's already there. It's already part of podcasting. Google Play Music coming and supporting podcasting is great. That helps too, because now you have a direct URL. You can put in emails that send out to people and say, hey, subscribe here. Or when you meet somebody, you can say, hey, go to Google Play Music if you have an Android device, or go to iTunes, a podcast app if you have an iOS device. That pretty much covers, the vast majority of the population. So now it's native in both platforms finally. So that really helps.
I completely agree with you, especially on the celebrity thing. I've literally repeated those statements many times to other smaller independent podcasters who have sort of thrown those same arguments at me. And I say, exposure is exposure, and audience size is audience size, and who cares who's bringing it, is the gist of that. But it feels like to me, Rob, that it feels like there's this pending storm coming, and maybe I'm being too pessimistic about this, but between the public radios and this push for more sort of transparency and data-based knowledge, and I've listened to Marco, and I've listened to Jason, I've listened to Mike Hurley, and all these Federico Vitici's article and all this stuff, but it just seems like there's going to be a day of reckoning coming, and it scares me to death that there could be some wholesale changes occurring that will sort of take away sort of as good of things as are right now. Am I worried for no reason?
You're worried for no reason. First off, Marco's article was great. Yes. It was brilliant and it was wonderful. And there isn't going to be coming wholesale changes because, first off, Libsyn is, people don't realize this. Libsyn is a bigger entity in the podcasting space than all of public radio combined, and doubled. So that Libsyn is responsible for well over 25% of all the consumption that comes out of iTunes through the podcast app and that. So it's not going to happen. Libsyn is dedicated to the indie podcasters. So what you got right now, you're going to have. So we can tell you that. If Apple goes and makes statistics available, it's a big, big, big if, depending on what all these articles are out there. But even if they did, that doesn't change the space. And they're not going to lock it down. And they can't lock it down. It's RSS and it's still available to everyone else. So, whatever people want to say and whatever they want, people are always going to panic and, the fear of the unknown. But there's been no one better. There's been no one that's done more to podcasting than Apple and iTunes. Apple, podcasting would not be where it is today without Apple. And yet people bemoan Apple and beat up Apple all the time. If you want to bemoan or beat up anybody, beat up whoever the two morons were that spoke to the New York Times.
Right.
Whoever that was that spoke to the New York Times did more to hurt podcasting than anyone else, because if the Times article is right, and they went and they pulled 7 of the bigger podcasters out, I said this on the Feed episode recently, if they really did this and they had them sign NDA, then 2 idiots went and showed Apple that no, podcasting is still amateur hour because we don't even understand what the N in NDA means.
Right. Exactly.
And I come from a background I mentioned earlier, electronics world, and I work for, I signed NDAs with Lockheed Martin in Northrop Grumman back in the day. And if you broke those NDAs, black SUVs pulled up in front of your house at 2 a.m. and off you went, and no one's heard from you again.
Yeah, don't want to do that.
Right. So, there's just a lot of FUD going around. But I think Marco's article was probably the best one out there of all of them. I read a lot of them.
Yeah, and there was a great podcast conversation. I know Upgrade with Jason Snell and Mike Hurley had 2 consecutive weeks. They brought in Lex Friedman from Midroll, and they had another great conversation about it as well. So some really interesting stuff out there on this particular topic. So
But yeah, the reality is people think public radio is this dominant force in podcasting, and it's not. They're way less than 1% of all the podcasts that are out there. Much less than 1%. And all the public radio combined is less than 15% of the downloads that are out there.
Well, I appreciate you waxing poetic with me on that particular concern, because I have a feeling that others may be, having similar concerns. But I'm glad to hear that it's unlikely something to be overly concerned with. So,
yeah, I mean, Apple's done a great job supporting podcasting, and they will continue to do that, I believe, in my heart. I get to talk to the folks at Apple. I know the folks there, and they are a great bunch of guys and women, and they really are supporting this community, have supported this community, and community wouldn't be where it is today without Apple. And there's always going to be naysayers and people that think Apple has too much control. But you know what? Apple has as much control as they have is because that's where the consumers are. And it's still a great place for people to discover podcasts. And it is the number one place. It is the 800-pound gorilla, but the gorilla is not. He's been pretty nice to us.
He's been pretty nice. He's a kind gorilla. Kind gorilla.
Yes. It's Magilla Gorilla.
There you go.
I mean, that's how Apple look at him as Magilla Gorilla.
Rob, take a moment, if you would, tell folks where they can find all about you, follow you on the Twitters, and if they want to find the ebook we were talking about, the feed, Today in iOS, anything, let them know.
Well, if you want to email me, that's the easiest one, is rob@libsyn.com. So it's Rob as in Robert, R-O-B at Libsyn, Libsyn.com. And you can find my Podcast 101 book for free in iTunes. Just search for that. Again, not a dime. It'll teach you how to podcast. There's a new version coming out. Hopefully I'll have it up in iTunes prior to Podcast Movement. That's my goal. And if you want to listen to me more, todayinios.com for that podcast. The feed. If you go to thefeed.libsyn.com, that's our podcast where we talk all about podcasting. And then, of course, there's Podcast 411 that's still out there. And then if you have a kid, my son has a podcast, Porter's Podcast. He started when he was 5 years old.
I remember that. I'm going to link up to all those things in the show notes as well, folks. And Rob is a great advocate for the independent podcaster. And Libsyn, I've been a marvelously pleased customer since the day I started this thing. And seriously, folks, Rob's ebook literally will give you a play-by-play to get this thing going on your own if that is something you're interested in. I can personally vouch for it. So, Rob, thanks for taking the time.
Dan, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Folks, that'll do it for episode 93 of the Podcast Digest. Until next week, my name's Dan Lissette.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.